Hello, I'm Audrey Seeley, but before that I was Audrey Bartholomew. And I am the granddaughter of a Civil War veteran. In 1862, at 13 years of age, Francis Marion Bartholomew enlisted in Company D, the 123rd Infantry. When his age was discovered, they put him in as a drummer boy, and that's what he did for a while. He fought through the Civil War, and he remained in service for 12 more years. He helped settle the West, and at one point he was commanded by Buffalo Bill. Quite a life for a lad from the little community of Clemens, New York. He eventually returned to his home, where he was known as the youngest vet in his area. And every Decoration Day, anybody knows Decoration Day? Memorial Day. He'd strap on the drum and on my dad as a little fellow, and they would lead the parade. And as my dad said, these were some of the special memories he has of his father. Now, when my father wrote this poem, he wrote a little forward. I won't read all of it to you, but he is explaining in his own words the reason for the title of the poem, If Drums Could Talk. And I quote, "The drums have been closely associated with the veterans and of the veterans of the Civil War, the Spanish War, World War I, and World War II. And he said, I feel they merit a place of recognition in this poem. Therefore, I use these drums as instruments of expression to convey to you the proper concept of this brief narrative." These drums were stored overhead in an old general store in Clemens. Anybody familiar with where Clemens is? It's above Whitehall. And that store is no longer there. It's gone. And I wish I knew what happened to the drums. But these drums will speak to you through this poem. Throughout the poem, they'll be telling a story. If Drums Could Talk. Tucked away in a country store on a remote shelf of the second floor, recalling days when they used to roar, are two old drums that are played no more. For the sons of vets, these drums were bought after the Civil War was fought. Many a tale these drums could tell, like the tunes they've played, they know them well. Of the bygone days, their echo rings. But let us go back where the story begins. Arouse the herald that often sings of the joy the golden memory brings. And journey with us to the humble place where the dusty trophies safely lay. For they'll take you back through this time and space to tell you of events of another day. A reverent concern, a moment of silence, awaited with anticipation. For the drums have been quiet and undisturbed since they played on that last decoration. Listen to us, snapped the rustic old snare. We're going to play some familiar airs. While the big bass boomed with knowing accord, and it seemed in the distance a bugle was heard. The introduction was promptly given. Yankee Doodle in lively rhythm. Marching through Georgia came next in line, then the Gilligan's Guards in 4/4 time. The Campbells are coming in Kingdom Come. The Girl I Left Behind Me was done. At last the signal was given to cease, then snapped the snare. Attention, please. In 61, on a certain day, a boy of 13 ran away. An overgrown lad for his age, they say, and he joined the ranks of the USA. He fought in that war with his countrymen. As a drummer boy, he had to begin. But he liked that racket, that young blue coat. We're fighting for freedom, he'd often quote. He finally traded his old snare drum for deadlier weapons, a sword and a gun. All through that struggle, he gave his best. Then after the war, he went out west. Still in the service of Uncle Sam, 12 more years of his life began. Most of his regular occupation was promoting the Red Man's reservation. Once commanded by Buffalo Bill, he chased the Indians over the hill. The youngest vet of the Civil War, they called him, for 70 years or more. All through his years, he was loyal and true to the cause of the old red, white, and blue. In the First World War, he gave a son to put the Germans on the run. Every year at Decoration, he always led the celebration. And on that day, when dawn had brightened, we drums were secured, dusted, and tightened. The youngest vet and his youngest son strapped us on, and the noise begun. They spanked us hard, and they spanked us plenty. Most of the tunes were from the 18th century. And when events were over that day, we were loosened again and stored away. But we feel that we played an important part, inspiring the patriotic heart. We noble drums have done our best. Like the youngest vet, we've gone to rest. But who can tell or who can say that we'll ne'er be heard in another day? The youngest vet has left behind 7 grandsons, brave and kind, who answered the call of their country too. And now they fight in this war for you. We've tried to be brief, said the old snare drum, but now I'm sure our story is done. This tribute of honor we proudly mention. Thanks a lot for your kind attention.
Our other program is the reading of the letters and the journal. We very excitedly got this notebook, or this book that I was telling you about, and it was 160 typed pages. We went, okay, right? You know, we knew we had an hour to do this in, but we were so eager to read it that we divided it up into 4 slots, and we all took one home and just kind of devoured it. Came back and met 2 or 3 times on it as how we should do it. Finally decided that each would take 40 pages. And those 40 pages, they would sift through the things that seemed to be the most remarkable to them, and that's what we've done. So each of the people will speak in sequence of how the pages read from page 1 to 140. Lois gets the first reading, and her reading relates to his adjustment to the military, and the letters, mostly letters home, very little journaling, but mostly letters home. Beverly Collier has Gettysburg, which was one of her favorite places that she visited in vacation. And even though I haven't been to Gettysburg, which I plan on going now after hearing about it, I feel as though I know it very, very well. Let me tell you, she's going to do Gettysburg, which is very interesting. The third area of concern or of reading is going to be done by Sandra Davis, and this is about his one real battle where he senses that he could have been killed. And he writes about this, about how the first time that he really understood what that could have meant to him. And then Robert Wright, our fellow here, is doing the end of the journaling. And that was the part that I read, that 40 pages. And I tried to read it. I tried to do my duty and step up here to the thing and give my all, but I just couldn't get through it. So Bob agreed to come and take over. The one letter that he wrote was very moving, and then you could see a change in his behavior and his attitudes. The war had wore him down. So I give you our voices and enjoy.
And Jane.
Oh, Jane! Jane is going to the memoriam to Robert. Sorry about that.
That's fine. Good evening, everybody. I'm Jane Shields Hayden, and I'm just thrilled to pieces that my cousin Rolf Kipp, and he lives in Ossining, and he has made up these 2 wonderful folders of letters from Lieutenant Robert Crookshanks. And Mr. Kipp is the great, Mary Wells is the great-grandmother of Mr. Kipp. And Mary Wells was my grandmother's sister, and that makes me, she is my great-aunt. Okay. So I will read some of this papers here that I have. In reading the transcript, it became evident that the letters were general and personal. He often stated in various letters that he had included pages from his journal. The following letters of Lieutenant Robert Cruikshanks are a printed version of a handwritten transcript prepared by him of letters he sent his wife, Mary Eliza Wells, during the Civil War. The transcript is on file in the reference section of the Bancroft Library in Salem, which is pretty exciting. So I'm going there to see the original. And was given to it by the undersigned Rolfe Kipp, a grandson of Robert and Mary's daughter, Ella. The text of the transcript was placed on the internet website, and it tells where. A. Cruikshanks, a great-grandson of Robert and Mary. It was downloaded from the website in its present format. The reproduction of multiple copies in the format of Robert's letters, the addition to them of the introduction and memorandum, which is Robert's obituary, published in Salem in 1902 in that newspaper, the Axiom. And the design of the front cover of the binder for these copies were all undertaken by Stephanie Kipp, the daughter of Rolfe. The esteemed subject of this notice died at the residence, the Ondawa, of his son, Harvey B. Cruikshanks, on the morning of September 13th, 1902. He was the son of Peter and Elizabeth McKnight Cruikshanks and was born in the town of Salem, September 1st, 1836. Receiving his education at the public schools, he entered successfully at early manhood upon the business of carpenter and contractor in Salem. In 1860, he wed Mary, daughter of Henry Wells of Salem. He was a veteran of the Civil War. He enlisted in Company 133 Regiment, New York State Volunteers, August 25, 1862. He was appointed first sergeant of his company, August 25th, mustered into the United States service September 4th, commissioned 2nd of February, 1863. And it goes on to tell where he was stationed. He had many places in Alabama, Georgia, and other places. He participated in the following battles, and it was Chancellorsville, Virginia, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Cassville, Georgia, Dallas or New Hope Church, Georgia, Lost Mountain, Georgia, Pine Hill, Georgia, and on it goes. And then there were a lot of places in North Carolina, and you're welcome to read this after. Returning to his home from his loyal and brave defense of his country, to which he had unflinchingly offered his own life as needed, he quietly resumed his duties and privileges of his citizenship. In 1874, he was Commissioner Postmaster of the village of Salem, which position he held most acceptably to its citizens for 12 years and 4 months. In 1885, he founded the Salem Axiom, that's the newspaper, which under his untiring zeal and ability became a successful and influential Republican county paper. Increasing ill health compelled him to relinquish his connection with the Axiom in favor of his son, Robert Cruikshanks, the present editor, on January 1st, 1865. Mr. Cruikshanks was a member of the United Presbyterian Church. He was the oldest member of the Odd Fellows in Salem, his membership commencing in 1857. He was for many years a member of the Village Board of Education, in whose affairs he took an active interest. He was also an influential member of Post A.L. McDougal, number 570 GAR. Lieutenant Cruikshanks contracted serious physical complications during his service in the Army, from which he never recovered, and which eventually terminated in his death after years of debility and great suffering. Through it all, he manifested a true soldier's uncomplaining patience. He keenly appreciated the tender and loving care extended to him by his devoted family and the many friends that he had. In the summons to lay down the burdens of the flesh to go hence, during his whole career, from boyhood until the end, Robert Cruikshank's record was unblemished and without challenge. His life was pure and unselfish to a marked degree. So now I will turn the rest of the program over to all the other ladies. Thank you.
This is excerpts from a very long letter which Robert Cruikshank wrote home to his wife. It's dated May 8, 1863, camp near Stafford Courthouse, Virginia. Dear wife, I now take this first opportunity in 2 weeks to write you. We have had no mail going out until now. I have written this as I had time and have dated it the day of the mailing. No doubt you have been looking for a letter for some days, and this will explain why you have not received one, and I hope will relieve you of the anxiety which I know you have suffered. I have passed 4 fearful days and nights since I last wrote you. We have had the hardest fought battle of the war, and gained nothing but suffered defeat with a terrible loss of life and property. Brother Will was severely, but not dangerously wounded. He was wounded by a musket ball, which passed close by my head, passing entirely through one of his thighs, entering the other side until it struck the bone. Then passed down, lodging near the knee on the opposite side. I will speak of him further on in another letter. I will now give you a detailed account of our march and battle, if I am not broken off by having an opportunity to mail this. In starting out, the men were in the best of spirits, singing and jesting, enjoying the change of being relieved from the monotony of the camp. But as the day advanced, it grew warmer, and some of the men had not obeyed the order to abandon all unnecessary clothing, to take but one blanket or overcoat and one change of underclothing. They began about noon to throw them away, and the road was covered with them. The next morning, April 28th, was like the morning before, clear and warm. But the men, having relieved themselves the day before of some of their load, were in good marching order, and after having a breakfast of coffee, hardtack, and pork, they started on their second day's march. In the afternoon, the cavalry met the enemy, but they fell back, and as we advanced and at night, we camped within 1 mile of Kelly's Ford on the Rappahannock River. The next morning, we crossed the ford without opposition. We pushed on, not halting for dinner. The cavalry in advance of our column had taken possession of the mills and ford with the loss of 1 man. They captured 200 men and 2 officers. They were guarding the ford and framing a bridge to replace one that had been burned. After crossing the bridge, we marched about 2 miles and went into camp about sundown. On each day of our march, we had started at sunrise and marched until 6:00 p.m. The next morning, April 30th, we were ordered to take another road to make a reconnoiter where we fired into a rebel battery. This was our first under fire, and the men showed no fear. The 28th Pennsylvania Regiment had a skirmish with the cavalry and lost 1 man. We marched until 5 o'clock, then went into our camp near Chancellorsville, about 7 miles from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Chancellorsville proved to be the battleground. The pickets held their ground as long as they could, but were soon driven in. The regiment, hearing fire on the picket line, received orders to advance and pushed forward over a fence where we were exposed to the sight of the enemy when they opened fire on us. We could not see the enemy in the woods and did not fire on them until we had taken position on the top of a cleared hill in sight of the enemy, when they came to the edge of the wood. The roar of cannon and the roll of musketry were terrific, and it was no wonder that some of the boys that were behind the largest trees in the woods began to move back to look for larger, but were observed by Major Rogers, who started for them with drawn sword, calling out to them, quote, "The first man who leaves his post, I'll run him through." The men called Major Rogers the fifth wheel, in comparison to the extra wheel carried in the limber of a caisson of artillery. All night we lay on the ground, and the men kept their guns in their hands, expecting to be surprised at any moment. Our regiment was held in reserve all day until 4 o'clock, when we were ordered to make a feint towards Fredericksburg, so that the right could advance their line to a better position. At 4 o'clock, we formed in line of battle and advanced into the woods. I should think for about an hour until we came to a clearing. We remained there about half an hour when the right wing of our regiment moved away, breaking at the colors, leaving the colors with us. We worked all night cutting down trees and gathering stumps and piling them in front of us. We could build no fires to cook coffee and had eaten nothing since the morning before. Just before light, no sound could be heard but the whippoorwills, and there seemed to be thousands of them in the woods in front of us. In the afternoon, our regiment was called to attention, and General Hooker's profane order read to us, and was also published to the whole army, which was this: I have got the enemy where God Almighty cannot save them. Could a general expect to succeed and defy the living God? I was shocked when it was read and thought perhaps God will save them. The enemy attacked on the evening of May 2nd, and on Sabbath morning, when the sun arose, it looked like a ball of fire. We had our picket out, and when they were driven in, we were ready to receive them. They appeared in one solid mass of living gray. The whole woods in front of us seemed to be full of them. For 5 long hours we held our ground, and with but a single line of infantry backed by 40 pieces of artillery. The enemy charged on us in solid column again and again, their battle cries sounding above the roll of musketry, the roar of cannon and bursting and crashing of shell. Our ammunition was becoming exhausted, and our men worn out and weak from hunger, having had nothing to eat in 24 hours, not even a cup of coffee. And at 9 o'clock, one half of our men were among the killed, wounded, and missing. Some had been taken from the field, and some were able to get away themselves. Brother Will had gone. This was the last struggle to hold our ground, but we could not do it. Our line had become so weakened, we were not much more than a skirmish line, and on the right of the road, they had suffered as much as we had. The enemy came on to us closed in mass, backed and driven in by their cavalry. Their center was on the plank road and extended on either side about a quarter of a mile. I ordered my men to move backward and to the left of the regiment giving away at the same time. While we were going back, the enemy opened on us with shell and solid shot, which made it rather warm for us. The enemy came as far as the creek, and as soon as we were out of the way, our artillery opened on them with canister, which they could not stand before. They did not make another charge. After the regiment had been reformed near Chancellorsville House, we were marched to one place and then another until about 2 o'clock. As we were passing through the woods, I noticed a place a little way from us and heard someone call my name. And looking about, I saw Brother Will resting on 2 sticks he had cut and was using them as crutches. He told me how badly he was wounded. I could not stop, so I told George H. Eddy of our company to stay with him and get him to a hospital and not to leave him until he did. Then I went on and joined the company, feeling relieved from my anxiety about him. We kept moving all afternoon, and the next morning a heavy rainstorm set in, and it rained all day and night. We marched all day Wednesday in the rain, not stopping long enough to cook coffee, making a distance of 25 miles, and arrived at camp at Stafford at 5 o'clock p.m. We were glad to get into our old quarters and get some rest. Our cook had got back to camp some hours before us. The baggage wagons also had arrived. We put the covering on our tent, built a fire in the fireplace to dry it, and had provided a good supper of soft bread, sweet potatoes, beefsteak, coffee, and sugar. With the recollections of enjoying these, I will close this narrative from Your affectionate husband, R. Cruikshank.
Saturday
Saturday, June 20th, 1863. We are yet in camp near Leesburg, Maryland. The inhabitants are all rebels and talk very saucy and bitter toward the North. The men rejoice at this, as they are allowed to forage and can live well on the country. They can get here potatoes, onions, milk, butter, flour, mutton, veal, and pork, and sometimes a hive of honey. One fellow was eating honey in the dark after it had been taken from the hive and got several bees in his mouth and was badly stung. The next day he could hardly talk, his tongue was so swollen. Wednesday, July 1st, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg. I am almost worn out today. We marched about 30 miles yesterday. We broke camp this morning at 7 o'clock, marched back until we struck the Gettysburg Pike, then marched toward Gettysburg about 4 miles and halted. Here I had dinner and finished our company reports and muster and payrolls. At 2 o'clock we started on our march again, halting within a mile of Gettysburg and formed in a line of battle. We could hear cannonading and sharp musketry firing on the farther side of the village. We moved a short distance, taking a new position near Wolf Hill. We were not brought under fire. The fighting ceased about 7 o'clock p.m. We lay down to rest with guns in hand, without covering, so as to be in readiness to receive the enemy should they make an attack. We could eat no supper. Thursday, July 2nd. This morning we had crackers and coffee for our breakfast, the only food we could get, and I relished that. After we had our coffee, we were moved forward and took a position in the front line on the right of the cemetery, resting on Rock Creek. Here we built breastworks by felling large trees, trimming the limbs off and laying one on the other. Skirmishing on our left was kept up all day and in the open fields. If a man should expose his head to the enemy, he would soon hear the whiz of a sharpshooter's ball pass it. We had finished our works and were thinking that we might rest a while about 6 o'clock when an order came to fall in. There was hard fighting at this time to our left. We fell in at once and marched rapidly away from our works in the direction of where the battle raged furiously on the left, which was on Round Top. When we reached the foot of Round Top, we advanced with a terrible shower of lead, with shell passing over our heads, some of the shell coming so close that many of us had to bow to them. When we had reached the top, the enemy had fallen back. Fresh troops were advancing, and we were not needed at that place anymore. We had gotten within 80 rods of our works when an officer rode up to Colonel McDougal, telling him that the enemy were occupying his works. The colonel did not credit this report. Colonel Selfridge of the 46th Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers suggested that he entertain the truth of the report before advancing his brigade. Lieutenant Marcus Beadle and a part of Company I were ordered to do the work. Lieutenant Beadle deployed his men and advanced. While he was getting ready, the men of the regiment were going to a stream, in front of which ran from Spangle Spring to fill their canteens with water. Men were coming from the other side and filled their canteens. It was so dark they could not tell who each other were until they got together. And then our men saw that they on the other side were rebels. They informed Lieutenant Beadle what they saw, which he did not credit, and yet was careful to save his men. He advanced with them across the stream and then halted his men and challenged them with, "Who is there?" The reply came, "Pickets from the 2nd Division of the 12th Corps. Come on, it's all right." Lieutenant Beadle knew that the 2nd Division of our corps was on our left when he left our works, and now thought, well, maybe they moved out so that they extended their picket line, so as to hold our works. So leaving his men where they were, Lieutenant Beadle went forward himself and discovered too late that they were rebels and he a prisoner. The enemy then told him to order his men to advance, but he ordered them, "Fall back, men," which they obeyed at once, having heard the conversation between Lieutenant Beadle and the enemy, and they were saved from capture. As soon as our men began to fall back, the enemy opened fire on them, the skirmishers firing as they fell back. July 3rd, 1863. After we had retaken our works, there was no firing along the whole line until 1 o'clock, when the enemy, all at once, as if by signal of one gun, opened fire with their artillery, and were quickly replied by our artillery. Upwards of 300 pieces of artillery, all firing at one time, with as many shells exploding. Such a terrific roar. flying of broken shells, splinters of torn trees were never heard or seen before and probably never will again. July 4th. The excitement of battle was now over, and we were all almost starved. The first day of the battle, fresh beef had been brought into a field near us and thrown from the wagons onto the grass where it had laid in the sun for 2 days. The men would go and cut off slices and broil it in a fire on a stick and eat it without salt. The stench from thousands of dead men and hundreds of horses that lay all around us was sickening. I could neither eat nor drink anything while in our works. The dead of the enemy must be buried. I was detailed to take charge of some men and bury the dead. In front of our regiment, I found the ground literally covered with dead bodies. Officers in their gray uniforms lay there with their men. The men could have all the private property they found. All the Army property must be turned over to the brigade provost marshal. I visited the center of the line and saw dead men piled one upon the other, the dead bodies nearly covering the ground. Our loss in the regiment was only 14. I have but one shirt with me, a calico one. Every night I have gone to a stream, taken it off, washed it, wrung the water out of it, and put it on again, and let it dry on me. Often I would not dare to remove my shoes for fear I wouldn't get them on again. July 14th. Firing was kept up by the rebel pickets only to deceive us and allow Lee and his army to cross the river. The cannon we saw on the hills were logs, sawed about the length of a cannon, and with the end painted so it looked like them in the distance. July 25th, and this is where I'm adding just to save a little time here. Lieutenant Cruikshank became ill. This is the 25th, and the Battle of Gettysburg ended the July 4th. But the 25th, he became ill with fever and weakness, and he rode horseback and ambulance to a boarding house in Washington, D.C. So that's where he's reading from. July 31st, the enemy, now this part is kind of what went on while he was away from the regiment. So, but he's, obviously somebody told him what went on and he wrote it all down. So this is July 31st. The enemy advanced their picket line to the opposite side of the river. The pickets did not fire on each other and often indulged in conversation. Our men called the rebels, when speaking to any of them, Johnnies, and they called us Yanks. 2 or 3 days after the lines had been established, the men were very well acquainted. One day, one of our men called out to the picket on the opposite side of the river, "Say, Johnny, were you at Gettysburg?"
Yes.
"Got licked, didn't you?"
Yes.
"Well, if you'd stayed home, you wouldn't have got licked."
That's so.
In a short time, the Johnny began to ask questions and called out,
Yank.
were you at the... Oh, sorry.
Yank, were you at Chancellorsville?
Yes.
Got licked, didn't you?
Yes.
Well, if you stayed home, you wouldn't got licked, would you?
No. August 17th is when he came home to visit. So the next writing is September 13th, which tells of his trip back to the Washington area and to a seminary hospital in Georgetown. This is an excerpt from a letter to his wife, Mary, dated November 19th, 1863. The women and children in this part of the country, this is in Camp Bridgeport, Alabama, are flocking into the station for supplies, and many of them are going north. I saw at one time 12 women with families of children waiting for transportation to go north. They all had to draw army rations to live on. Our government is feeding large numbers of Southern people. Not men, for most of them are in the Southern Army, but the wives and children of those who are fighting us. First Lieutenant Cruikshank then was promoted, again my words, to an officer of the regiment on December 2nd, 1863. He says, "I report to the adjutant and am in his office. I keep a record of all the business I do. I am to examine all men and ascertain why they are here. Then, after providing for them, send them on to their respective commands. If we remain here and this business keeps up, I shall get tents and establish a soldier's home. My office hours are 8 to 12, midnight, and from 1 to 5 p.m. January 2nd, 1864, I had an opportunity to make a fortune when I was first detailed in the commissary department, but my principals would not let me engage in this business. The man who wanted me to go into business with him would do all of the work and give me half of the profits. He had been in the business on a small scale and knew what he could do if he could branch out. It was this. He wanted me to buy whiskey for him by the barrel, as I could get all I wanted for $1 a gallon. He would furnish bottles, reduce the whiskey, bottle it, and sell it for $2 a bottle. He established my share of the profit would not be less than $410 a day. He could sell all that he could get at that price. Thousands of men were passing through the station daily and would buy it. I know a fireman on the railroad who has smuggled large quantities through from Nashville in the water tank of his engine and sold it at $2 a bottle by the case. I thought a good name and a clear conscience better than a fortune and refused to have anything to do with the business. Sent out an order for a vidette, and 2 people refused. They said it was sure death to go out there. Then I asked if there was a man in the company who would volunteer to go out as a vidette. Henry J. Cleveland came to me saying he would go. I gave him instructions and he went. I soon heard him talking to somebody in a low tone of voice. He soon returned saying they were close to us, that he had taken one of their vedettes for one of our men and talked to him. But when he moved from behind a tree, he saw his gray clothes. Henry moved back and the rebel called for him to halt, but Henry thought he'd better report to me. In a short time, we heard the enemy give the order. Forward, double quick, march! They came down on us as fast as they could go through the brush, screeching and yelling. Our men gave them one volley and then fell back. They were in 3 lines of battle. When Captain O.S. Hall and his company had fallen back to some piles of rail that had been thrown together in our advance, Major Tanner ordered him to make a stand there. As soon as I heard Major Tanner give Captain Hall the order to make a stand, I ordered my men to halt, as I knew I must support his left. I had only got my men checked when Major Tanner gave the order for every man to take care of himself. The enemy were upon us, some within 10 feet of me, and caught hold of 5 of my men that were nearest to me. Their names were Benjamin A. Dewell, William H. Butler, James Conway, Daniel R. Ross, and William R. Welch. I was so near the enemy that I could not run to the right and keep under cover of the woods. But to keep from being caught, must keep straight ahead through the open fields and run the risk of being shot. I chose the latter, as I preferred being shot rather than being taken as prisoner. I had a half-mile to run to get into our lines. The 5 men nearest me, being caught on the left, left me alone, so I ran down across the open field, through the ravine and up the hill to our line of battle on the top. Bullets kept whizzing around me as I ran, and when about halfway up the hill, I came to a stump of a tree, about 10 feet high and 2 feet through. Being out of breath, I stopped behind this stump until I could recover it, and then go on. Here I could see what was going on. Being between the 2 armies, behind me was the enemy in 3 lines of battle advancing in a charge in good order. In front of me on the hill was a single line of battle of Union soldiers and 2 sections of artillery placed about a quarter of a mile apart, all waiting to receive the enemy as soon as the 123rd Regiment came in. The officers were arching back and forth behind their companies, ordering their men to hold their fire. That the skirmishers were not all in. I had seen the rest of the skirmishers, the regiment, that ran to the right and left into the woods in advance of me, so I was the last to go in. I could stay behind the stump but a few moments, so ran again. As the enemy caught sight of me, they began to fire their bullets, flying all around me. I reached our line without a scratch. As soon as I got in, the commanding officer inquired of me of the 123rd had got in. I told him how they were ahead of me and had fled to the right and the left of the woods. The enemy were now only a few rods away, advancing in 3 fine lines of battle, when he gave the order to fire. My work for the present time was done, and I could look on, and such a sight I shall never forget. I could only see the fight in front of our brigade, in an open field. As soon as General gave the order to fire, there was one prolonged cheer from our men, and at the same time there was a crash and a roar of artillery and a roll of musketry. It seemed as if heaven and earth had rolled together. The first blow only shocked the enemy a moment,
The shouting, yelling, and frantic mass started up the hill again with a fury which it seemed could not be checked. Before they had advanced 30 feet, our artillery gave them another charge. The cannon was loaded so heavily that they would spring back 10 feet, but the men were there at the wheels, and it was but a few seconds before they were loaded, double-shotted with canister, primed and fired. These guns were placed so that they had an enfilading fire on the enemy. The infantry were all the time pouring deadly volleys into their ranks. They could make but slow progress. When the canister would sweep out in space in their ranks, they would close it up again and start on the advance. But soon another charge was ready for them. When they had got within a few feet of us, we raised a shout, gave them a volley right in their faces, and at the same time the artillery sent their charge of canister nearly lengthwise of their line. This they could not stand, and they sent them back a-flying into the ravine. Here they were under cover from our fire, and here they reformed again, and as many times they were driven back. Their artillery in the woods back of them kept throwing shell at us all the time. Many of their wounded came crawling into our lines. The fight kept up until dark. After dark, the enemy picked up their dead and wounded by torchlight. Before dark, the regiment reformed again. I had 10 men less than I had in the morning. 2 were killed, 3 wounded, and 5 taken prisoners. The loss in the regiment was 48, I losing over 1/5 of the whole. I was assisted during the day by Lieutenant Beatty, which I believe is Bob's ancestor. And this is one little excerpt I wanted to read so you'd have some idea of what happened to the Southern people. On the way through Atlanta, Georgia, we saw houses that our shell had perforated. In many parts, the people had dug holes in the ground, then placed timbers over and then covered them with several feet of earth so that the shell could not penetrate them. The sides of our guns were left open so that the people could crawl into them. These were the only safe places they could find from the explosions of our shell while they were under siege. These places were called gopher holes. I do not know whether they derived the name from the animal gopher or because the people, when they heard our shells shrieking through the air, would gopher them. And I might add that I am the great-granddaughter of a Civil War soldier.
These are journal entries and a couple of letters, and they're interspersed. And I arranged them in chronological order. As a history student, that's the only way I can handle history. December 3rd, 1864. The colonel started with his brigade at 5:30 this a.m. and joined the 1st Division, which was 2 miles in advance at 6 a.m. By the way, this is on the march to Savannah. We did not march on the railroad, but on a wagon road about 2 to 4 miles north of the railroad and running parallel with it. We halted for dinner about 3 miles north of Millen. It was at this place that the enemy had one of their prisons. The prison pen contained 40 acres of land, all in the open field with no buildings to cover the poor fellows confined there. Over 700 had died in this pen, as the graves of that number testified. We found the road in very good condition all day, marching 14 miles and camping at Horse Creek for the night at 4 o'clock p.m. December 15th, 1864. We have our tents up and are in very comfortable quarters. There is plenty of gray moss growing around the trees, which we gather for beds and carpeting. The men's rations are very short, and the officers can get nothing but a little rice. We have rice for breakfast, and rice for dinner, and rice for supper. We relish it every meal. We have so little. Duty is light, so we do not require hearty food. December 16th, 1864. There is no change from what we have been doing in the last few days. Picket and camp duty are performed. Picket and artillery firing are kept up. Rations are getting shorter every day. The men are anxious to take Savannah as they know they will have plenty of rations when they get there. They are expecting every day. They are expected every day by the way of Fort McAllister. This is a letter to his wife, Dear Mary. Savannah, Georgia, January 16, 1865. Dear Mary, the Southern people think the people of the North are queer people. They see we are graceful in manners and polite to them, and will also thank a slave whenever he waits on us and converse with them. They never stop and talk with them. When we were in the city, the colonel and his staff called on the mayor, and when about to leave, the mayor invited the colonel and his staff to come and dine with him the next day. The colonel thanked him, but said he should be pleased to come another day, that we were invited out the next day to dine with a man at a certain number and street. "I?" said the mayor in astonishment. "That man is a nigger." "No," said the colonel. "He is as white as I am." The mayor said, "That makes no difference. He is a nigger. He was a slave at one time, but bought his freedom, educated himself, and is now a man of property. But he is a nigger just the same." I have seen the handsomest girls here in Savannah that I have ever seen anywhere. They are slaves and house servants. All through the South, the best looking and smartest girls are taken for house servants. They are better clothed and better fed than field hands. Many of these house servants have children by their masters or masters' sons. This is the worst feature of slavery. I saw at the house of an owner of a plantation in Georgia, while on the last campaign, a good-looking woman, I should say an octoroon, who had two fine-looking white children of whom she had the care, and I noticed she did not call them master and miss, as was usual when a slave speaks to a white free child. I asked her if those children were her master's, and she said they were. I then asked where her mistress was. She said that she had none, that she was her master's housekeeper. I then asked where the mother of the children was. She said she was their mother, and I said nothing more. And since then, I have seen black mothers and white children. I have asked no questions. The slave owner talks about his good stock of Negroes as much as a northern man does of his cattle or his sheep, and talks about improving it the same. I write you the above that you may know what slavery is, as the people of the North know but little of its sin. All will be free as soon as the war is over. It will be many years before they can assert their rights. We are to move soon. We have had a review marching through the city of Savannah. It was one of the finest I have ever seen. We are under marching orders and ready to move at an hour's notice. I do not know which way we are to go, but it is reported that it is across the river and on to Richmond. If the weather is good, I had as soon be on the move as to remain in camp. If we keep at work, the war will soon close, which is the wish of Your affectionate husband, R. Cruikshank. Diary, February 16, 1865. We marched only 5 miles today and camped within 3 miles of the Congaree River, opposite and within 4 miles of Columbia. The greater part of this march was through pine forests, and they were on fire. Foraging was poor. The enemy in this section would not take any of the foragers prisoner, but if captured, they suffered death. Their bodies were found mutilated with papers pinned on their breasts on which was written, "Death to foragers." The men retaliated by burning everything that they did not want to carry away that would burn. I have known of them carrying the sick out of the planters' homes into a Negro shanty so that they could burn the houses. I could tell how far the line of march was advancing by the smoke from the fires. Letter to Mary, Goldsboro, North Carolina, April 9th, 1865. We are under marching orders again. We have just got our camp and quarters in nice order when you have to leave them. We do not regret leaving them, for we know the more we march through the enemy's country, the sooner the war will come to a close. What we eat of them will not go to supply the Southern Army. It is hard on the women and children, but I do not see how that can be helped. It is not known yet which way we are to go. I do think a long campaign is anticipated I do not think a long campaign is anticipated as we have not provided for one. Everything is in fighting order and the men are anxious to start out. They prefer living on the country to hardtack and salt pork. I will write as soon as I can. Affectionately, R. Cruikshank. Diary entry, April 17th, 1865. The camp is quiet as a graveyard. The report has just reached us that President Lincoln has been assassinated. The heart of every soldier is filled with sorrow. The men threaten that if they have to follow Johnson's army, they will show no pity. I know it will be hard to hold them in check. Every town will have to suffer as towns had to on former campaigns where the soldiers have found slave pens, where they have been sold at auction, where there would be whipping posts and stocks. Plantations and towns where these were found were soon reduced to ashes. Journal entry, May 10th, 1865. This again is the march toward Savannah. We went through Libby Prison and saw where so many of our poor soldiers were confined, sickened, and died. It looked like a large storeroom. We were then shown into the cellar where the dungeons were. They were built of heavy plank across one side of the cellar, each one being about 3 feet square on the ground. The cellar was dark, and all the air that the prisoners could have was the damp cellar air. There was a hole in the door large enough to pass in a dish of food. There was about 3 inches of water running over the cellar bottom all the time, so when the men were put in these dungeons, they had to stand in this cold water. They could not lie down while confined there. I was told that some were kept there for days and have been found lying dead in the water. They would become so weak they could not stand. It was awful to think of. We were shown in the cellar where the soldiers removed the stone from the wall and tunneled under the street to a tobacco shed on the opposite side, and a few made their escape. This was the prison where my great uncle was in prison after he was captured in Gettysburg. He was in Libby prison. We passed from this building across the street and a short distance to Castle Thunder, which looks like another large warehouse, a dark and dreary building. In this building, we saw all kinds of shackles that had been worn by our soldiers while confined there. I here thank God that I have escaped all the sufferings. With my not very good health and weakened constitution, I never could have lived through these hardships, nor would my health have allowed me to endure the hardships of a private soldier. Libby Prison was in Richmond, so I made a mistake saying it was on the way to. May 15th, 1865, Spotsylvania Courthouse. As the brigade were to make a halt of an hour or more, I took the opportunity to ride over the battlefield. Between the lines near the left center of the Union forces, there was a small house standing in which a woman remained all through the battle. She was in the cellar. The house was riddled with bullet holes. Near this place, I was shown the stump of a white oak tree over 2 feet in diameter that had been cut down entirely by musket balls. I afterwards saw the trunk of the tree in the village. A man had it locked up in a building and was charging a fee to see it. I rode on to the center, which was an open field to the right of the Wilderness Road. Strewn all over this field lay unburied the skeletons of men who had fallen in that charge a year ago, the 10th of this month. They lay in their uniforms with their 2nd Corps badge on their caps. Some places there would be piled 6 high. In the woods farther to the right, there were more than in the field. In the edge of the wood, a soldier lay under a small tree, his white handkerchief torn in shreds, tied to a limb about 4 feet above him. Evidently he had been wounded and was not able to move from the field and had tied his handkerchief to the tree to attract attention. None came and he had to die alone. We know not how long he was exposed to the elements, suffering from hunger and thirst before death came to relieve him of his suffering. This is only one case in thousands who had died in the same way. At 10:30, the bugle notes sounded the advance, and we were soon on the march again. Taking the road to Chancellorsville, we passed over the ground that the enemy occupied in front of our regiment at that battle, the place where Stonewall Jackson fell near the Plank Road 2 years ago, the 3rd of this month. He wasn't in the Battle of the Wilderness that he was recalling a year ago, but he was in the close-by battle of Charlottesville 2 years ago. We halted about 2:00 p.m. near where the Chancellorsville house stood. I now had an opportunity to look over the battlefield where I was first initiated into the art of war. As I walked over the battlefield, I thought of my comrades who had fallen there. I could pick out the very spot where they fell. I visited the spot where Colonel Norton fell, the place where we lay on the soft ground all night before the last terrible day. I saw a great mistake in the formation of our lines. Whoever did it is in part responsible for our defeat that day. I went back over the same ground that I did that day in our retreat, thinking of the shower of shot, shell, and bullets that I and the handful of men who were with me passed through in going up the hill to the Chancellorsville house. And I thank God that he had kept his protecting arm above and around me through all the dangers. I had passed through in the last 2 years of Army life with a prospect to soon be restored to my family again. The assembly sound of bugle came to us together, and we started again to march to level ground at the United States Ford, where we camped for the night. That concludes what I have. A lot of Robert Cruikshank's memoirs are in the book about the 123rd Regiment marching to save a nation, which is the history of the 123rd. And there's just a part in here about his illness, if you want to read about his illness a little bit. Sure. Also heading home to recover was Sergeant Robert Cruikshank. He had battle fever and diarrhea for 2 months in camp and hospital, along with several other soldiers of the 123rd New York. Besides the typical typhoid, the men were knocked down with scurvy, chronic diarrhea, and congestion of the lungs. From his bed, Cruikshank was glad to hear the remaining healthy men of the unit were building better quarters. They had been forced to endure cold, wet weather and tents, the men having no place where they could get warm or dry out their clothing. That with the poor food put many men on the sick list. Cruikshank was first in a ward with plenty of bed rest and decent food, bread and soup, and improved. Once shifted to the convalescent ward, he had to walk to a dining hall for meals on regular Army fare, coffee with molasses, bread and hash, bread muffins remaining on the soup, potatoes, and whatever meat scraps were available. The soldiers were greatly resented the table at the end of the dining hall set aside for the nurses, hospital wardens, and attendees. Boxes of food sent by families to the soldiers would be confiscated only to wind up on this table to be eaten by the staff. This was justified in the idea that patients should not have unfettered access to food. Germ theory was lacking on the operating slab, as was dietary understanding in the recovery ward. Cruikshank did use some of the money of his wife sent to clandestinely purchase some butter, hiding it under his bed by tying it to a slat. He would slip his piece of bread, they got one slice, under his coat at dinner, toast it over the coal stove back in his ward, and spread the butter on it. He shared the butter with his 123rd comrades. The bed also had some strawberry preserves that had gotten through from his wife. But Cruikshank knew it was a losing battle and understood the cause. "It is my food that is pulling me back." He deteriorated again. He tried to keep his wife's spirits up in his letters. "You said a year ago, when all or nearly all of the babes born were boys, that it was a sign of war. And now you write they are all girls, so that must be a sign of peace. And if that is so, the war will soon be over, so you should cheer up." The doctor sent Cruikshank's wife Mary to come for him. 2 months of Army care had nearly put him in the grave. 2 months of his wife's care had brought him back to report for duty.
But in the book of Robert Cruikshank, they fought on after Lincoln was assassinated because no one declared an ending to it. Right. And then the painful march back to Washington, then the painful train trip back to New York. When they reached Albany, he had had several good meals, delicious meals on the way back. He reached Albany Station, and they had in a wash tub a big tub full of potato soup, mostly water and little potato, and he said he was never so glad to reach home. So,